Eric Anselman, the 451 group. Device support is great, and we're moving forward in a lot of that, but a lot of what we've talked about this morning, and especially given that this is the enterprise panel, the piece that starts to complete this is management. Where do you see that happening, and which parts of that do you see HP heading after?
So I described those three layers, the infrastructure layer, the control plane or controller layer, and the management layer. And HP has products, of course, that fit in all three of those categories today, right? And so our plan is to evolve those products to use SDN and OpenFlow technology and thereby create a better solution. So I'm not sure exactly what your question is getting at. We've got a management application, IMC, for networking, and it will be a management application that will fit into our solution space.
Well, mostly just we were talking about levels of abstraction and both representations, both of network structures, management structures, and where those play. The different vendors are looking at approaching this in different ways, and we're just sort of curious what your views of slicing and dicing how those problems were.
Okay, yeah. Well, I think one key point that I want to reinforce that I made earlier is that in terms of a conceptual model of how you manage your network from a management perspective, the idea is to be able to create these virtual service networks, these logical purpose-built networks for a specific application or set of applications, right? And to be able to partition, the things that you need to reason about down into, I want to deploy this application, voice over IP, whatever it is, and can I think and reason about that in isolation of these other things that I also need to do and get that right, and then move on to my next application of interest, right? And so I think part of a key thing that we need to be thinking about is, what is the conceptual model that a network administrator would have as they approach our tools and begin to use them? And I think that's really kind of the key thing with respect to management, I think, is to present that model. There's certainly, we all have experiences with using technology where things aren't as transparent as we would like. You begin to learn how to use a system, and you build up a conceptual model of what might be happening behind the scenes, but you're never really sure. And then at some point you make a change, and then things break, and you realize you didn't understand what was happening behind. And so we need to be able to present a conceptual model that's very easy to understand and transparent. So I think that's really one of the key focuses that I would like to see the research community work on is developing that management conceptual model, really, that provides that transparency. I think we saw some hints of that earlier today in the research presentations. Thank you.
Dave? You can ask a question? Oh, are there other I have a question.
Okay.
Say a little bit more about your experience with hybrid switches. For example, in your hybrid switches, do the OpenFlow part and the conventional part share any resources? To what degree is it just ships passing in the night? How do you do this a step at a time?
Yeah, so certainly the resources are shared within the chip, within the ASICs and the switches. And so there is like any place where you might have multiple controllers, if you will, operating on a shared resource, right? You need to arbitrate and figure out how to use those resources. And that actually is the issue that we have today. When you think about someone using a variety of different features on a switch, whether it's policy-based routing, ACLs, multicast filtering or something like that, all of those features can be using the common resources within a switch. And so the switch now arbitrates between those and figures out who has priority and who gets filled in and who doesn't, right? And I think what happens with OpenFlow is that if we can consolidate, into a single API, that's a good first step. We still have a prioritization problem, but we can start consolidating. So in a hybrid switch, to answer your question, you do share resources, and you do need to deal with that conflict. But I mentioned earlier about how we've got, L2 control happening on a network, and L3 control, and ACLs, and multicast, and so on. All these things actually are operating on the network at the same time today, before OpenFlow, right? And so we actually have a number of controllers. They happen to be distributed, in the various control protocols, but we do have a number of controllers, if you will, on the network. And I think what OpenFlow allows us to do is to consolidate that number down to a smaller number, right? And a hybrid switch can start bringing in those control planes, right, into one. And they may not all be included at the same time, but you can start working in and reducing the complexity.
Okay, thank you. Yes?
That's okay. Derek Silva from Infotech Research Group. The 60 or so deployments that you have out right now, great spread geography-wise, which is, good to know in terms of the demographics. Well, it looked like a decent spread. But what about size? Presumably not very many small businesses, but is there a decent spread between medium and large enterprises, or is it primarily your large enterprise customers that are interested in this and piloting it right now?
The majority of the deployments so far have been for research purposes.
Right.
So I mentioned that a couple of them were production, but the majority are test beds. Some of those customers are higher education customers. Some of them are commercial research. Some of them are startups. So it's kind of that mixture. And so generally what we see is smaller deployments. They're not large, 20 switches, 40 switches on that order.
But the actual organizations testing them right now, are they, like you mentioned some startups in there, so obviously they would be smaller, but
There are some very large enterprises, or very large, I should say, commercial research entities that are working on OpenFlow and using our
Great, thanks.
equipment. Yes. So it really does range, though, because you have low end, or I should say smaller deployments, but there are some large ones.
Very good. Thank you, Charles.